Lord Gerald Marsh had not removed his hand from the hilt of his blade since he entered the hall. He stood beside his assigned seat at the long stone summit table, with his jaw set hard, and his eyes locked on the empty chair at the head of the room, as if he were quietly calculating how many steps it would take to reach it. The guards posted along the walls had noticed. The lords and governors seated nearest to him had noticed. The senior aides standing at the edges of the room had noticed. But no one said anything, because saying something to Gerald Marsh when he looked like that was one of the faster ways to end a perfectly survivable morning. The Iron Peak Territorial Summit convened once every 5 years. Every pack leader, every regional lord, and every border governor across the known territories gathered under the same roof to discuss land, law, and the shifting boundaries between them. On paper, it was a meeting of order. In practice, it was 5 days of barely restrained grievance, with a formal structure laid over the top of it like a cloth over a fire, and it had been that way for as long as anyone sitting in the room could remember. Today, with Gerald Marsh's hand already on his blade before the session had even been called to order, it was already worse than usual. Clara Bird moved quietly along the edge of the room to where Owen Holt, the king's chief strategist, stood near the eastern wall, and stopped beside him without making eye contact. She kept her voice low and still. "He arrived with 6 men," she said. "He was authorized to bring 2. Owen kept his gaze on the main door. "I know. 3 of the northern lords have already spoken with him privately this morning. I am aware. Should we delay the opening?" "No," Owen said. "We wait." The door opened. King Adrian Cole entered the hall the way he entered every room he walked into, without ceremony, without announcement, without the kind of deliberate performance that people of lesser authority sometimes use to compensate for what they lacked. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that was not particularly neat, and gray eyes that moved across the full room the moment he crossed the threshold, cataloging it in the specific way of a man who had spent enough difficult years knowing that any room could turn. He wore no crown at the summit. He had never needed one. The people in the room straightened without being asked. Even Gerald Marsh went still, though his hand remained exactly where it was. Adrian walked to the head of the table. He sat down. He placed both hands flat on the surface. He looked at the room. "We will begin," he said. Gerald Marsh, almost imperceptibly, let go of the blade. The first hour of the summit moved the way these sessions always moved, slowly, and with a great deal of rehearsed grievance, and very little genuine forward motion. A lord from the eastern valleys presented a complaint about a trade road that had been misrouted during last year's northern floods. 2 governors argued over shared water rights, in terms so circular that the argument seemed to be feeding itself. A pack leader from the southern territories raised concerns about winter supply routes that had been raised in essentially the same form at the previous 3 summits, and had not been fully resolved at any of them. Adrian listened to all of it. He asked questions that were fewer and sharper than the situation seemed to require. He did not perform patience, he simply had it. The kind that came not from ease but from the long discipline of being in charge of things that were too large to manage with impatience. When the argument between the 2 governors over water rights circled for the 3rd time, he said, "Submit your evidence to the Water Claims Office by the end of day 2. I will have a determination for both of you by day 4. That was the end of that. In the far corner of the hall, at a small writing desk set against the wall at a slight angle to the main table, Finn Ward worked. His pen moved without pause. He had developed a transcription system over 4 years of summit work, and 7 years of council record-keeping before that, abbreviations for recurring phrases, numerical codes for each speaker, margin markers for moments of heightened tension or formal agreement, that allowed him to capture a full session, without falling more than a sentence behind the conversation. It was efficient. It was invisible. Both of those things were deliberate. Finn was 26 years old. He had been doing this work since he was 19, which meant that more of his adult life had been spent in rooms like this one than outside of them. He had learned, in that time, how to make himself part of a room's furniture, how to be present without being noticed, how to move through formal spaces without generating the kind of attention that created complications. He was good at it. He had needed to be. As an Omega, in a world that made its assessments about a person before that person ever opened their mouth, Finn had understood before he had a full vocabulary for it, that visibility was a specific kind of trap. Omegas were expected to be accommodating, soft-spoken, easily directed. The ones who appeared in administrative roles did so in supporting positions, managing files, facilitating the flow of correspondence, handling the paperwork that the people who actually ran things could not be bothered with. They were useful. They were not significant. They occupied the margins of rooms rather than the centers. Finn had understood this so clearly and so early that he had built his entire working life around a single strategic principle: be indispensable in ways that no one could directly see. Do excellent work, do it quietly, accept no credit, and invite no attention. He had done this for 11 years. He was very good at it. He was also, on the inside, doing something else entirely. He had been doing it since he was 19. He had 6 private journals locked in a box under his bed, each one filled with his own analyses of council decisions, his own assessments of policy debates, his own arguments about what was being done wrong and what the right answer actually was. Not one of those journals had ever been read by anyone but him. He kept them because the alternative was to simply not think these things at all, and that had never been something he was able to do. The session shifted. Gerald Marsh cleared his throat with the controlled deliberateness of someone preparing to make a point he had been building toward for months. "I want to address the northern border," he said. The room changed. Not noisily. It was the opposite of noisy. The kind of quiet that settles over a space when every person in it simultaneously decides that whatever happens next is not something they want to be seen reacting to prematurely. Adrian looked at Gerald. "Go ahead." Gerald leaned forward with the measured ease of a man who had rehearsed this more than once. "The territorial line your people redrew last spring. My family has governed land on both sides of the original marker for 3 generations. That line was moved without my meaningful consent and in direct violation of the spirit of the summit agreements. I want it formally acknowledged, in this room, in front of every representative present, that what was done was improper." "The redrawing followed the terrain adjustment process defined in the summit agreement," Adrian said. "The original markers were destroyed in the northern floods. The new markers were placed according to natural terrain, which is the established procedure under those circumstances. You were notified in advance. You signed the notification. I signed under the impression that my objection would be formally heard. Your objection was received and reviewed. The determination was that the new line was correct." "By your people." "By the Border Council," Adrian said, "which includes representatives from 6 territories, none of them operating under direct Crown authority. 2 of the 6 have direct family ties to your senior advisors," Gerald said. "Which has been public knowledge since the council was formed, including when you were invited to submit an observer to that same council and declined." It was precise, calm, and difficult to argue against. But Gerald had not come to this summit to be deflected by clean counter-arguments. He let a beat of silence settle before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice was quieter and considerably more deliberate. "There are those who believe," he said, "that the interpretation of law in this kingdom has been drifting in a consistent direction over recent years. That direction being whichever direction benefits the Crown. I want to be clear that I am not speaking only for myself when I raise this concern." He did not look at the other lords when he said it. The hall went very still. In the corner, Finn's pen had stopped. He had not meant it to stop. He was watching Gerald Marsh, watching the specific satisfaction behind the man's eyes, the expression of someone who had planted exactly what he intended to plant, and was now watching it take root. It was not the expression of someone who genuinely believed he had been wronged. It was the expression of someone who had constructed a grievance to cover a different agenda entirely, and was now watching whether the construction held. Finn looked at Adrian. Adrian had not reacted. His posture had not shifted by a single degree. His face was completely still, in the way that Finn, watching from across the room, read as something different from calm. It was the edge of calm, the controlled surface of something that had a direction. "If you have specific evidence that any council decision was improperly made," Adrian said, "submit it in writing to the Independent Review Board before the end of this summit. I will ensure it is addressed formally." He paused one deliberate beat. "Anything else?" Gerald stared at him. "No," Gerald said. The session continued. Finn resumed writing, but one part of his attention stayed with what he had just observed, and behind it, very quietly, another part of his mind was doing something it had been doing for 11 years without being asked. Connecting, cross-referencing, assembling a pattern from pieces that no one else had collected in the same place at the same time. The northern border, the redrawing, Gerald Marsh's anger, an iron ore survey filed 8 months ago, a budget projection submitted to the Finance Council the previous winter, a mineral deposit located 2 miles north of the original border marker. With the old line, the deposit sat inside Gerald's territory. With the new line, it sat under Crown jurisdiction. Finn looked at his page. He was a record keeper. He kept writing. When the evening meal break came, Finn packed his satchel and headed for the staff corridor. He was almost through the door when one of the king's personal guards appeared at his shoulder, as if the wall had produced him. "Working notes from today's session," the guard said. "The king wants them now. East Corridor study room." Finn went. The room was small and warm, lit by a fire that had been burning long enough to have settled. Maps covered the central table, weighted at their corners. Adrian stood at the far end of the room with his back to the door, looking at the largest of them. "Set them on the table," he said. Finn set the satchel down. He should have left. "Is there something specific you are looking for?" he asked. The king turned. In the hall, across a crowded room, Finn had been able to absorb that look and let it pass. In a small room with only a fire and a table between them, it landed differently, direct, measuring, unhurried, the kind of attention that did not filter itself through politeness. "You transcribe every session," Adrian said. "Yes. And you remember what you transcribe." Finn chose his words with the care of a man who had learned that specific words had specific weights. "I do my job accurately." "I am not asking about your job," Adrian said. "I am asking whether you remember." A pause. "Yes," Finn said. Adrian asked which lords had raised previous complaints about the northern border at past summits. Finn did not reach for his notes. He gave the answer directly. Lord Philip Grant at the last summit, who had withdrawn after the Water Rights Amendment, a written complaint from Lord Dorian Ashby 2 years prior that had not been raised in session, and a governor's objection from the summit before that, submitted by a woman named Claire Weston, who had since retired. Dates, outcomes, precise. Adrian was very still for a long moment. "Sit down," he said. They worked through the notes together for the next hour, Adrian asking and Finn answering, neither of them noticing when the evening meal came and went without either of them eating. The questions were good questions. Finn found himself answering them more directly than he normally permitted himself to speak in rooms with powerful people, and he was aware of that, and was not sure what to do about it. When he finally stood to go, the fire had burned lower, and the larger map had been repositioned twice. He stopped at the door. "The actual issue is not the border," he said. Adrian looked at him. "Gerald Marsh does not care about the line," Finn said. "He cares about what sits 2 miles north of it. There is an iron ore deposit on that land. The survey was filed 8 months ago. With the original line, it fell in his territory. With the new line, it falls under Crown jurisdiction. If you argue the border directly, you will argue it indefinitely. But if you submit a formal extraction claim on the deposit before this summit ends, the dispute moves into mining rights law, where your legal position is significantly stronger, and the council review process favors the Crown." He stopped. He had not planned to say any of it. He was not sure what had made him say it. Adrian was very still. "What is your name?" he said. Finn hesitated 1 beat. "Finn Ward." "Thank you, Finn Ward." Finn nodded. He left the room before anything else could follow. He walked back to the staff quarters quickly, sat on the edge of his narrow bed, and looked at the wall for a long time. He had spent 11 years perfecting invisibility. In the space of a single evening, he had let himself be seen. He opened his private journal. He sat with the pen in his hand without writing anything. He thought about gray eyes in a firelit room, about the specific quality of being listened to by someone who was actually listening. He thought about the weight of saying something true after 11 years of saying only what was required. He told himself it would not happen again. He almost believed it. The morning of the second summit day began with noise before Finn reached the main corridor. He heard it while still in the side passage, raised voices, something heavy falling, and the quick sound of boots on stone. He rounded the corner and found a young servant on her knees gathering pieces of a broken tray, her hands moving fast and her eyes down, while one of Gerald Marsh's guards stood over her with his arms crossed, and the particular expression of someone who had decided that watching was more interesting than helping. "Pick it up faster," the guard said. Finn stopped. He looked at the guard. He looked at the girl. She was perhaps 17, with reddened eyes and a rigid jaw that told him she was working extremely hard not to show what she was feeling. He stepped forward. "That is enough," he said. The guard turned and looked at him, the way that people looked at something they were deciding the value of. He looked at Finn's plain gray clothing, the simple leather satchel, the complete absence of rank markings. He took his time with this assessment. Then he said, flatly, "Omega," and nothing else, as if that single word resolved every question about whether Finn's opinion was worth addressing. "Yes," Finn said, "and I have been transcribing every word spoken in this summit since yesterday morning, including what you just said to that girl, and how you said it. Whether that material appears in the formal record, or in a conduct report to the Crown's administrative office, is a decision you are making right now." The guard looked at him. Finn did not move. The guard uncrossed his arms. He looked at the girl, then at some point past Finn's shoulder, and then he turned and walked away without speaking. Finn crouched beside the servant and helped her gather the last broken pieces. "If it happens again," he said, "go directly to Clara Bird. She is the King's protocol officer. Tell her exactly what occurred. She will address it." The girl nodded. She collected her tray and left. Finn straightened and continued to the hall. He sat at his desk. He told himself that stepping forward had been a simple matter of doing the right thing. He transcribed the opening of the session. He did not think about why the simplest matters sometimes required the most conscious effort to act on. The morning session ran 40 minutes over its scheduled end. 3 additional lords requested the floor, each with disputes that were individually specific but collectively coherent. Land assessments, boundary reclassifications, territorial reviews, all from the previous 2 years, all pointing in the same directional drift. The pattern was not announced, it was not organized in any visible way, but it was there, and Finn saw it while the room discussed each complaint as if it were isolated. He made a small notation in his margin, a circled letter G. He would not forget it. During the midday break, instead of eating, Finn went to the archive room, adjacent to the East Library, presented his staff credentials, and spent 40 minutes pulling records from the previous 3 summits. He was looking for the origin of a pattern. He found it in less than 30 minutes. 7 of the current complaints could be traced back to land assessments, initiated through a single surveying firm. The firm's contract chain followed carefully through 4 intermediary documents, connected to a financial holding that was registered under a name that was not Gerald Marsh's, but was one step removed from it. Someone had been making small, strategic moves in low-profile spaces for years, building a case through process rather than confrontation, accumulating the material for exactly this kind of summit ambush. Finn sat with that knowledge for a moment. He closed the files. He thanked the keeper. He went back to his desk and transcribed the afternoon session with the same steady pen he always used. But the knowledge did not leave him. It sat in the back of his mind the way a stone sits in a shoe. Not dramatic, not disabling, but impossible to forget. He stayed late that evening to finalize the formal transcription. The hall emptied gradually around him as staff cleared out, and the last of the daytime guards rotated to their overnight positions. By 9 in the evening, the room was amber and still, lit by half the usual number of lanterns. The long table cleared, and ready for the next day. He was alone, or thought he was, until he wasn't. The voices came from the narrow alcove behind the east column. 2 men, speaking in the low and careful way of people who did not want to be heard, but could not resist finishing the conversation. "Not at the summit," one said. "There are too many guards." "It does not need to happen at the summit," the other said. "It needs to happen before the end of it, before he files the claim. Once the extraction claim goes in, it moves to council review, and Gerald loses the whole argument. The filing cannot happen." Finn went completely still. His pen stopped. He breathed. "He is going to file it before day 5, the first voice said. "Which is why day 3 is the window," the second said. "Before the evening session. The kitchen has been arranged." A pause. "That is a significant action," the first voice said. "Gerald has calculated the risk," said the second. "The question is the timing." Footsteps. A door opened and closed. The voices were gone. Finn sat in the empty hall for 60 seconds without moving. Then he picked up his satchel, walked out of the hall, and went directly to the east corridor study room. The door was locked. He found a guard near the stairwell and said, "I need the king immediately. Tell him Finn Ward says it concerns the extraction claim and that it cannot wait until morning." The guard looked at him with the standard calculation. "Now," Finn said, and something in the word, in the level, undecorated urgency of it, made the guard go. 4 minutes passed. Then Adrian appeared around the corridor corner, already wearing the expression of someone who had been interrupted mid-thought and had decided whether the interruption was worth it. He saw Finn's face, and the expression changed. "What happened?" he said. Finn told him everything. The voices, the alcove, every word he had heard, in the order he had heard it. He did not speculate. He did not add. He reported. When he finished, Adrian was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he turned to the guard behind him and gave 2 instructions, in a voice too low for Finn to catch. The guard left at a quick walk. Adrian looked back at Finn. "You are certain?" "I do not misremember what I hear," Finn said. "I know," Adrian said. Something in how he said it, not with surprise, but with the ease of a statement he had already established in his own understanding, was strange and precise at the same time. "You will not be returning to the staff quarters tonight," Adrian said. "A room in the guest wing will be arranged. My people will handle the rest." "I am a record keeper," Finn said. "I do not require." "You are currently the only person in this building who heard what those 2 men said," Adrian said. "That makes you relevant to my security, in a way that overrides your job title for the duration of tonight." Finn considered arguing. He looked at Adrian's face and decided it would not accomplish anything practical. "All right," he said. They walked down the corridor together, not quite side by side and not quite separately, and Finn was acutely aware of the distance between them, in the way you are aware of a lamp in a dark room, not looking at it directly, but unable to stop being conscious that it is there. He was also aware, with an uncomfortable clarity, that this was the 2nd consecutive day he had made himself visible to this man. 2 days of summits, 2 conversations that had lasted longer than they were supposed to, 2 moments of saying things he had not planned to say. He had spent 11 years building invisibility into a form of survival. Something was dismantling it, and he was not entirely sure whether to be frightened by that or something else entirely. He lay in the guest room bed that night and looked at the ceiling and told himself that it was the situation, not the person, that the circumstances had created an unusual sequence of contact that would resolve itself once the summit ended, and he returned to his desk in the corner. He told himself this with the same disciplined calm he told himself everything. He believed it less than usual. The danger to the king was neutralized quietly. 2 members of Gerald's secondary entourage were removed from the building before midnight. A kitchen contact was identified and escorted off the premises with no formal charge, because Adrian had decided, with the cold, clean precision that appeared to be his default approach to things that threatened what he considered his, that a quiet removal served him better than a public accusation. Gerald would understand what had happened. Gerald would understand that Adrian knew what had been planned. That was sufficient, for now. Finn learned this the next morning, when Clara Bird appeared at the door of his guest room at 7, with a cup of tea, and an expression that was professionally composed but carried, at its outermost edges, something that might have been a form of respect, if it had been given slightly more room to develop. "2 guards have been assigned to accompany you during summit sessions," Clara said. "I do not need guards," Finn said. "You prevented an attempt against the king's life," Clara said. "Whether you need them has become secondary to whether they are warranted." Finn accepted the tea. He did not argue further, because Clara Bird was self-evidently someone who had already worked through all possible counter-arguments and found each of them insufficient. He attended the 3rd day of the summit with a guard on either side of him, which was both genuinely inconvenient and undeniably safer. The morning session ran without incident. Finn transcribed. The Northern Lords continued their coordinated presentation of individual grievances, each one carefully distinct but part of the same collective architecture. Adrian moved through them with the same measured precision he had applied to everything since the summit opened, not dismissing, not conceding, rerouting each argument into the procedural channel that would handle it most slowly. It was a strategic patience that looked, from the outside, like simple administrative orderliness. Finn was not supposed to admire it. He transcribed it instead. The break between the morning and afternoon sessions lasted 40 minutes. Finn spent it at his desk, reviewing his notes from the previous 2 days, organizing the threads he had been tracking into a cleaner form. He was almost done when he heard the sound of boots moving quickly in the corridor outside the hall. Owen Holt entered the room first, moving fast. Then 2 junior council members, then 4 guards. The specific combination of speed and number told Finn what kind of news had arrived before anyone opened their mouth. Owen found Clara. He said 3 words. Clara's face stayed neutral in the trained way of someone who had practiced keeping faces neutral when the situation required it, and she went directly to the door that connected to the private council corridor. The main session was suspended 30 minutes early. Lords and governors were asked to stay in the building. No reason was given. No reason needed to be given. Everyone in the room knew what a suspended session with perimeter security meant. Finn closed his notes, collected his satchel, and followed Clara Bird through the connecting corridor. No one told him to follow. No one told him not to. He simply did it. And in the controlled urgency of the moment, no one in the corridor was paying attention to what a record keeper was doing. The war room on the 2nd floor was already occupied when Finn reached it. General Hugh Croft, a thick-set man, with a close-cut gray beard, and the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years making fast decisions in difficult circumstances, was standing over the main border map with one of his junior officers. Lydia Grant, the diplomatic advisor, was at the side table, with correspondence spread before her. 2 of the regional council representatives were near the window, speaking in low voices. Owen Holt arrived 30 seconds after Finn and took his place at the map table. The news from the northern border was more serious than a single line in a courier note could contain. 3 outposts had reported simultaneous incursions from an eastern faction that had been quiet for nearly 2 years. The timing was not coincidental. With the Iron Peak Summit underway, the kingdom's senior military and strategic leadership was concentrated in one building, focused on internal politics. The northern border was running on reduced capacity because 2 of the 4 commanding officers assigned to the northern region had traveled to the summit as part of the official delegation. The eastern faction had watched, they had waited, and they had moved when the mathematics favored them. The war room was tense and loud, in the specific way that rooms became loud when the people in them all needed different things from the same situation. Hugh Croft wanted deployment orders. Lydia Grant was concerned about whether an armed response would trigger a broader diplomatic rupture with the Eastern Territories. The junior council members wanted clarity on who had final authority. Everyone had information, and no one had the full picture assembled. Then Owen Holt put his hand on the edge of the map table, swayed, and fell. It happened quickly enough that 2 people in the room did not see it. A physician was summoned. Owen was conscious but pale, and the physician said words quietly to Clara that included the words heart and rest in a way that rearranged the room's understanding of the situation. Adrian was at the head of the table. He looked at the map. He looked at his remaining advisors, Hugh Croft, experienced and steady but deeply cautious by disposition. Lydia Grant, brilliant in negotiation but without military training. 2 junior members who had good intentions and insufficient authority. He looked at the empty chair where Owen had been. Finn was standing near the door. He had been standing near the door for 6 minutes. He had also been looking at the border map for 6 minutes. And in those 6 minutes his mind had been doing what it always did when given material to work with, which was connect things that had not been connected. He knew this map. He had transcribed the border reports that referenced it for 3 years. He had read the supply assessments. He had, in one of his private journals 2 years earlier following a smaller eastern incident that had been resolved without escalation, spent an evening analyzing the faction's historical approach patterns and writing down what he thought their next move would look like if they ever decided to make one. He had been right. He was looking at his own analysis playing out in real time. He should not speak. He was a record keeper, standing by a door, because he had followed someone else through it. The Eastern approach has 3 bottlenecks, he said. Every head in the room turned. He looked at the map, and he did not stop, because stopping now would be worse than having started. The first is the Croft River crossing, 12 miles north of Outpost 7. Even a partial holding force at that crossing splits their main approach. The second is the Valley Ridge at Marker 42. It is a natural choke point that their previous incursion specifically avoided, which means they know it and will avoid it again. which means you can use that predictability to funnel them into the ground you choose, rather than the ground they choose. The third is their supply situation. The Eastern faction's 2-year quiet period ended the same month that commodity prices dropped at the Eastern port. That happened 6 weeks ago. They restocked after the price drop. Based on the volume available at that price point, they are resupplied for roughly 90 days, not a prolonged engagement. They need this to move fast. If you hold the river crossing and cut off their access to the Walden Hill supply depot, you do not need to engage directly. You slow them. They run out of time. Hugh Croft looked at the map. He looked at it for a long moment. He is right about the river crossing, he said. And marker 42. I never considered using the ridge as a funnel. He looked at Finn. The supply price calculation. Where does that come from? The port market records from 6 weeks ago, cross-referenced with the Eastern trade volume projection submitted to the Trade Council in January, Finn said. Neither document mentioned the faction. The connection is indirect. But you made it, Lydia Grant said, quietly. I notice things, Finn said. He looked at the floor. That is not all you do, said a quiet voice from the head of the table. He looked up. Adrian was watching him, not with the complicated expression of someone managing a surprise, with the focused, direct attention of someone who had just had a thing confirmed that they had already begun to suspect. Stay, Adrian said. I need you. 4 words, said plainly. Not an order that demanded, but something between an order and a request, something that assumed Finn would choose to remain, and made that assumption clearly enough that choosing otherwise would have required a statement. Finn felt those 4 words settle somewhere in his chest that was not his professional instincts. He told himself that it was a logical instruction. The king needed analytical support. He was capable of providing it. He would stay, because it was the useful thing to do. All right, he said. He stayed. The next 4 hours were the most concentrated of Finn's professional life. He sat at the end of the table and answered questions. He cross-referenced figures from memory. He identified a discrepancy between the current map and the terrain that turned out to trace back to an outdated survey rather than actual geography. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He simply worked, and the room worked around him, and by 9 that evening, General Croft had declared the assembled plan solid, and Lydia Grant had declared it diplomatically defensible, and Adrian had declared it ready to implement. The room emptied. Croft passed Finn on the way out and clapped him once on the shoulder without slowing down. Clara Bird left with a logistics list long enough to require 2 pages. The regional members filed out. Lydia Grant paused in the doorway and gave Finn a look that was brief and considered, and said nothing out loud, but contained something that might, over time, become respect. Finn was gathering his notes when he realized Adrian had not moved. He looked up. Adrian was at the map table, not looking at the map, looking at Finn. You knew all of it before tonight, Adrian said. Finn did not answer right away. The bottlenecks, the supply timing, the incursion pattern. I had analyzed it privately, Finn said, in my own time. It was not your place, Adrian said, flatly. Not as a reprimand, as a man identifying the exact shape of something he had decided he did not like. Finn looked at the table. How long? Adrian said. Finn looked up. How long have you been doing that? Analyzing things in private that were not your place? A pause. Then, 11 years. The room was quiet for a moment. Go and sleep, Adrian said. We will speak tomorrow. Finn went, but he lay in the guest room in the dark and looked at the ceiling for a very long time, and what kept him awake was not the crisis, or the plan, or even the 4 words that had settled somewhere in his chest, like an object finding its resting place. What kept him awake was the specific look on Adrian Cole's face when he had said 11 years. Not surprise, not calculation. Something much quieter and more precise than either of those things. Something that looked, if Finn was honest with himself, like the face of someone who had just understood something important and did not yet know what to do with it. The summit ended on day 5 with considerably less violence than it had threatened to contain. The northern incursion was managed through the plan assembled in the war room. The river crossing held. The ridge served its purpose. The faction's limited supplies ran out before their advance went any further than the first outpost line. It was resolved in 72 hours, and was described in the formal record as a border incident rather than an engagement. which was technically accurate, and also the most favorable possible framing, which was how Adrian Cole generally preferred things framed when a favorable framing was available. Gerald Marsh's formal complaint was rerouted, exactly as Finn had suggested, into the mining rights review process. It stalled almost immediately under the weight of its own procedural requirements, which was where Adrian had intended it to stall. Gerald understood what had happened. He understood it with the specific comprehension of someone who had made a long-prepared move and watched it be deflected without fanfare. He did not raise the issue again at the summit. He filed his formal departure with the minimum required courtesy and left on the morning of day 5 with 6 men and an expression that gave nothing away. Finn packed his transcription notes, said a quiet word to the guards who had shadowed him for 3 days, and made arrangements with the administrative office to have his belongings returned to the staff quarters in the capital. Clara Bird found him before he reached the building's main door. "The king would like to speak with you before you leave," she said. "I assumed he would send a formal commendation through the standard staff recognition process," Finn said. Clara looked at him with the expression of a woman who had worked in court long enough that optimism struck her as mildly tiring. "He would like to speak with you," she said again. He followed her to the main study. Adrian was at the window when they entered, looking out at the courtyard where the last of the delegations were loading their carriages and their traveling cases and beginning the long returns to their respective territories. He turned when Finn came in. "Sit down," he said. Finn sat. Clara remained at the door. "I have a proposal," Adrian said. He remained standing, which was either preference or decision. Finn had not yet known him long enough to tell which. "The position of Chief Advisory Aide to the Crown has been vacant since my previous holder left for a diplomatic posting in the West 4 months ago. The role involves daily briefings, policy review, strategic consultation, and direct involvement in council proceedings. It reports to me personally." Finn was very still. "The position has historically been held by senior Alpha officials," Adrian said. "I am aware of that. I am also aware that historical precedent is not the same as wisdom." He looked at Finn steadily. "I am offering it to you." Finn looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Why?" "Because you prevented a serious situation at this summit and handled it without being asked. Because you carry information in your head that should be in formal reports and is not. Because whatever you have been doing alone and in private for 11 years is work that this administration needs done in the open." A pause. "Those are the reasons." Finn thought about his small desk in the corner, his packed transcription case, his locked journals. He thought about what it would mean to leave those things behind. He thought about every reason it was complicated and every reason it was dangerous. "The court will object," he said. "Some of them will. Yes. Formally. Yes. My designation is not a qualification for or against this role," Adrian said, with a completeness that left no room for anything to follow it. "I am king. The appointment is mine to make." He held Finn's gaze. "Are you accepting or not?" Finn looked at his hands for a moment. He thought about 19 years old and a hand raised in a council room that no one had acknowledged. He thought about 6 private journals and 11 years of right answers filed in places where no one would read them. He thought about what it meant to be offered, by someone with the authority to give it, the thing he had spent most of his adult life pretending not to want. He looked up. "Yes," he said, "I am accepting." The transition was quick and the first days were disorienting in a way that Finn had not fully prepared for. Moving from the staff quarters to the advisory wing felt less like a promotion and more like a change in the laws of physics. He dressed in the dark blue of senior advisory staff. He sat at the council table, rather than against the wall. At his first formal briefing, on a Tuesday morning, the shift in his physical position in the room was so strange that he spent a full 60 seconds studying his notes before he trusted himself to look at the people around him. The people around him looked back with the kind of sustained, evaluating attention that was the court's version of a comprehensive first impression. Some of it was curious, most of it was cold. Edmund Price, a broad man in his 50s, with a reputation for procedural correctness and a long record of formal objections to deviations from it, looked at Finn for exactly 3 seconds, and then redirected his gaze to the wall above Finn's head, which was the particular kind of dismissal that was too controlled to formally protest, but too deliberate to mistake. Finn wrote his notes. Adrian ran the briefing with the same precise efficiency he applied to every formal session. Within 10 minutes, Finn identified a base rate error in the Treasury projection that the sub-council lead had presented, small, but compounding through the following 3 figures, in a way that made the downstream numbers meaningfully inaccurate. He said so, quietly, with the specific page and line number. The sub-council lead checked. He found the error. He corrected it. Edmund Price looked at the wall above Finn's head for slightly longer this time. The work itself settled into a shape over the following weeks. Council meetings, policy reviews, briefing preparation, document analysis. Finn was good at all of it, not because it was easy, but because it was the work he had been practicing in private for 11 years, and could now do in the open. He identified things. He connected things. He was precise, and he was thorough, and he did not dress his conclusions in more language than they needed. The part that required the most management was not the work, it was the evenings. Most evenings, he and Adrian worked together in the study, going through the day's materials, discussing emerging issues, planning the sequence of upcoming decisions. It was the most substantive work Finn had ever been part of, and it was also the part where maintaining the appropriate interior distance was the most consistently difficult. Adrian argued with him, not managing him, not softening points to make them more acceptable, actually arguing, with the confidence of someone who held a position and wanted it tested. And when Finn's counter-argument revealed a gap in his own reasoning, Adrian would go quiet for a moment, and then simply revise his position and move forward, without making anything of the revision, without framing it as a concession. Finn had been in proximity to powerful people his entire working life. He had not encountered many of them who did that. In the 3rd week they had a 40-minute argument about Border Patrol rotation scheduling. Adrian wanted fewer handoffs and longer shifts. Finn said the fatigue data showed longer shifts increased errors after hour 4. Adrian said the handoff data showed transitions were the highest risk moment for miscommunication. Finn said the solution was better handoff protocols, not eliminating handoffs. Adrian said better protocols had been proposed 3 times in 10 years and failed to be implemented each time. Finn said that was a political problem being solved with a structural solution, which was the wrong approach to the wrong problem. Adrian stared at him across the desk. "You are right," he said. "I know," Finn said. And then, because he heard how that sounded, he added, "I mean." "No," Adrian said. Something moved briefly in his expression. Something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "You are right, that is all." Finn thought about that exchange later, in his room, in the quiet. Not about being right. About the way it had been said, without weight, without any of the management that surrounded acknowledgement when it came from people who were not accustomed to giving it. Simply the fact of the thing, stated and moved past. He told himself he was professionally assessing his supervisor's working style. He told himself this was a reasonable and appropriate thing to do. He kept telling himself this until the telling stopped being convincing, and then he lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling, and acknowledged, without any drama and with considerable discomfort, that he was in trouble. The weeks shaped themselves into a pattern that was unfamiliar, and then familiar, and then, in the way that demanding things become familiar through sustained engagement, simply the texture of his days. He arrived early. He prepared thoroughly. He worked long hours without complaint, because the alternative was working shorter hours, and the alternative had never held any appeal for him. The court's opinion of his presence at the council table remained consistent in its discomfort. He received it with the steadiness he applied to most things, which was the steadiness of someone who had been managing other people's discomfort with his existence for a long time, and had made peace, mostly, with the fact that comfort was not always his to provide. What was harder to manage was Adrian. Not Adrian as a professional challenge, not Adrian as a supervisor or as the king who had made an unusual appointment decision, but Adrian as the specific person who showed up to their evening sessions with his formal jacket, loosened, and the tension between his brows that eased over the first 20 minutes as the work took hold, and who had a habit of going very still in the moment before he changed his mind about something, and who had once, without comment or explanation, set a cup of tea on Finn's side of the desk and then started talking about a border report as if the gesture had not happened. He was not what the world said an alpha king was supposed to be. He was not performatively dominant. He was not demanding in his authority. He listened in the way that people listened, when listening was not a concession, but simply the obvious way to gather information. And he engaged with Finn's arguments as if the arguments had merit, because they had merit, not because he was choosing to be generous. Finn was aware that he was paying more attention to these things than his professional assessment required. He was aware that he had been paying more attention to them for several weeks. He was aware, in the specific way of someone who has studied the structure of things for long enough to recognize a structure when they are inside it, that something was developing that he had not intended to develop. He managed it. He was good at managing things. The late night that ended his ability to manage it came in his third month. The Eastern Trade Alliance had proposed a 40-page piece of legislation that had spent 8 months in committee without resolution. Finn had read all 40 pages twice and produced 6 pages of analysis. Adrian arrived with the document annotated in his own hand, which meant he had found time to read it during a day that had already contained 2 council sessions and a formal diplomatic reception. They went through it section by section. By midnight they had covered 31 pages. The fire had been added to twice. Neither of them had eaten the food that had been left on the side table. They reached a section on regional governance structure, specifically on whether PAC territories should hold direct representation in the central legislative process or continue to be represented through their lord intermediaries. Direct representation, Finn said, before Adrian had finished reading the section aloud. Adrian looked up. The current system builds distortion into the process by design, Finn said. A territory submits its concern to its lord. The lord processes it through the lens of his own interests before presenting it upward. By the time the concern arrives at a policy level, it has passed through at least 2 sets of competing interests that may bear no relation to the original concern. Direct representation removes one layer and one source of structural bias. It also removes a filtering layer, Adrian said. Direct territory volume would overwhelm the council. Then build a mediation structure that does not require the lord as the filter. A territorial affairs office with trained advocates who process incoming concerns without political investment. The filtering happens, but without the distortion. That restructures an 800-year-old system. The 800-year-old system produces 40-page trade agreements that spend 8 months unresolved, Finn said, gesturing at the document between them. Adrian sat back. He looked at Finn with the measuring quality that Finn had long since learned to identify as the prelude to a genuine reconsideration. You have thought about this before tonight. I have thought about it for years, Finn said. And then, because it was past midnight and the fire was low and he was tired, in the particular way that made his usual filters slower than they should have been, he said something he had not planned to say. I have thought about governance structures since I was 19. Policy, law, the mechanics of how decisions are made and why they are made wrong and what it would require to make them differently. I studied it in my own time with no expectation that it would ever matter, because the world I was living in had already decided that someone like me was present to support decisions rather than to inform them. He stopped. He heard what he had said. He looked at the table. I apologize. That was not relevant to the legislative review. It is the most relevant thing you have said in 3 months, Adrian said. Finn looked up. Adrian's expression was something Finn did not have a category for. Not pity. He would have identified pity immediately and responded to it poorly. Not surprise. Not the carefully managed tolerance of someone engaging with something inconvenient. It was fully present and direct and clear, and it was aimed at Finn completely. What did you want? Adrian said. Before this, when you were 19 and studying governance and no one was asking. Finn was quiet for a moment. I wanted to govern, he said. I wanted to be in the rooms where decisions were made and be part of making them, not for the authority of it, but because I understood it, because I could see the problems and I could see the solutions, and it was very difficult to watch the wrong decisions being made when the right ones were available. He paused. That is what I wanted. You already do that, Adrian said. You have been doing it since the summit. 4 words again. A different 4, but with the same plainness, the same absence of softening. Finn stood. He said goodnight. He left the room before anything else could follow, because something had already happened and he was not safe to remain near it. He walked to his room. He closed the door. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark without turning on the lamp. He had been in love once before in his life. Quietly, briefly, at 22, with someone who had been kind to him, and who had eventually made the expected choice and bonded with someone else. It had been a small and contained grief. He had recovered from it without significant damage and without bitterness, which he considered evidence of a reasonable interior life. This was not like that. This was something that had been assembling itself in the margins of his professional life for 3 months, patient and unannounced, and he had just arrived at the point where he could no longer pretend it was still under construction. He was in love with Adrian Cole. He sat in the dark and held that knowledge, and did not move for a long time. Named things were real, and real things had consequences, and the specific consequence of this particular real thing was too large to look at directly tonight. He would manage it. He was good at managing things. But even as he told himself that, he was aware, with the specific honesty that came only in dark rooms and late hours, that there was a difference between managing a feeling and choosing what to do with it, and that choice was still waiting for him, and was not going to wait indefinitely. The morning after that late session, Finn arrived at the briefing room, with his composure as clean as it always appeared, and his notes in their usual order. Nothing on his face was different from the day before. He had spent enough years building that face that it had become its own reliable skill. Adrian noticed the composure. He had been noticing it for months. Not the composure itself, but the variations in it, the moments when it was natural, and the moments when it was maintained with effort, the moments when something moved beneath it, that the composed surface, almost, but not quite contained. He said nothing about what he noticed. He ran the briefing. He moved through the day. That evening, instead of going to the study, he went to the records archive. He asked for the complete administrative file of Finn Ward. It arrived in a folder, significantly thicker than he had expected. The employment record itself was unremarkable. Entry-level transcription at 19, summit record-keeping from 22, a single formal commendation at year 4 from an administrative supervisor who had described him as efficient and detail-oriented. No other recognition. No promotion requests. No applications for expanded responsibility. The record of someone doing exactly what was assigned, and, to external appearance, nothing more. But the records office had been thorough in its cross-referencing. Attached to the main file, linked by contributor identification code, was a set of supplementary documents. Anonymous policy memos, unsigned analytical reports, budget projections submitted through the general open channel without attribution, but carrying the same contributor code that appeared in Finn's transcription work. 7 years of material. Adrian read it from the beginning. A memo from 7 years earlier identifying an inefficiency in the Eastern Trade Route assessment process that had, when Adrian checked against subsequent records, been quietly corrected 18 months later, with no credit assigned to any specific source. An analysis of PAC boundary conflict patterns that matched, almost exactly, the conclusions of a major strategic review, commissioned 2 years afterward, at significant departmental expense. A budget projection that had correctly anticipated a currency pressure event that the Finance Council had not seen coming. He kept reading. Each document was precise, methodical, and rigorous. None of it was the work of someone transcribing other people's ideas. It was original analysis of the kind that took years to develop and required both deep knowledge of how the system worked and enough distance from its daily operations to see where it was failing. It had been submitted through the most anonymous available channel, consistently, year after year, with no name attached. Adrian sat back. He thought about Finn standing in the summit war room, near the door, speaking about bottlenecks with the level certainty of someone describing something they had already worked out. He thought about Finn at the council table, quietly naming a number error that no one else had caught. He thought about Finn at midnight saying, "I have thought about governance structures since I was 19, and then stopping himself, as if the admission were a thing he was not permitted to make. He thought about what it meant to understand something at that level, to have spent years deepening that understanding, and to have spent every one of those years building a careful strategy of remaining invisible, because the world you occupied had decided your kind of person was not the kind that understood things." He sat with that for a long time. Then he went back to the archive and requested 5 years of summit transcription records, not the anonymous memos, the signed session transcriptions, officially attributed to Finn Ward as contributor. He read through 3 of them. They were accurate. They captured every word spoken in the sessions, but in a second layer of margin. Not the official annotation space, but a personal system running alongside the formal record. There were notes. Connections between statements made in different sessions by different speakers, threads that no single session would have revealed. Finn had been analyzing the council's decision-making in real time, in the margins of their own official documents, for years. And no one had read the margins. Adrian closed the file. He went to the window. He looked at the courtyard for a while. He thought about everything he had just read and what it added up to. He had been looking, throughout his reign, for people capable of the kind of thinking his administration genuinely needed, the kind that held multiple levels of a problem at once, that saw structural implications alongside immediate ones, that was both rigorous in its detail and wide in its frame. He had appointed good people. He had received good counsel. But the particular quality of mind he had been searching for, the one that held the whole picture, had found him by accident, in a corner, in a person who had spent 11 years making himself invisible because the alternative had not been made available to him. He thought about the cost of that, not to the administration, to Finn. He went to find Clara. "I need the complete administrative record of advisory appointments over the past 20 years, he said. Cross-referenced with the Open Policy Submission Archive. Clara looked at him for a moment. "This is about Finn Ward," she said. "Yes. You are building a case for something." "I am reviewing information," he said. "When you review information," Clara said, with the precision of someone who had worked alongside him for 8 years, "there is rarely a meaningful difference." She paused. "I will have it on your desk by morning." He went back to his office. He picked up the evening briefing materials. He read 3 sentences and set them down. He acknowledged to himself, someone who had spent a long time being careful about the difference between professional regard and personal feeling. He had watched enough people blur that line and seen enough of the resulting complications to have developed a strong preference for the distinction. He had been maintaining that distinction for 3 months. He looked at it directly now. What he felt about Finn Ward was not a blurred line. It was clear, and it was inconvenient, and it was also, in his honest assessment, not the primary issue at this moment. The primary issue was not personal at all. The primary issue was that there was a correct thing to do, and he had the authority to do it, and he was going to do it, and he was going to do it, before he said anything else, because he wanted the correct thing to stand on its own, without the possibility of anyone, including Finn, questioning whether it was motivated by anything other than what it was. He picked up the briefing materials again. He read through to the end. The first formal petition arrived on a Tuesday. It bore 11 signatures and was written in the careful, elaborate language that formal petitions used when they wanted to communicate something direct, while preserving the technical appearance of something indirect. It expressed concerns about protocol, about historical precedent in advisory appointments, about the importance of maintaining the confidence of the noble houses in the king's office. It did not say explicitly that an Omega should not hold a senior advisory position. It said a great deal of other things that meant exactly that. Adrian read it once. He wrote the required formal receipt acknowledgement and filed the petition in the position of something that had been received and placed on record, and would receive a formal response at the appropriate time. Appropriate time being, in this instance, a flexible concept he did not intend to rush. A second petition arrived 3 days later. 15 signatures. Edmund Price brought the third in person. He arrived on a Thursday morning and asked for a private word. Clara cleared the room. Edmund sat down and set his hands on his knees, with the deliberateness of a man who had served 3 successive kings and considered his own longevity as a form of institutional wisdom. "My concern is institutional rather than personal," Edmund said. "I want to be clear about that." "Go ahead," Adrian said. "The advisory role requires trust, the trust of the court, of the noble houses, of the people who bring their concerns to this office, and need to believe that those concerns will be received with appropriate gravity. If the court does not trust the person advising the crown, the court's trust is directed at me," Adrian said, "not at my staff." "In practice," Edmund said carefully, "those things are not fully separable." "In practice," Adrian said, equally carefully, "the quality of counsel I receive is more relevant to this kingdom's function than the comfort level of those around me." Edmund was quiet. Then he said, in the lower voice that meant the real point was coming, "There are those who believe your judgment in this matter has been affected by a personal attachment." The room went very still. Adrian looked at Edmund Price for a long moment. "Who says so?" he said. "It is a general sentiment. I am not in a position to attribute it." "You are entirely in that position," Adrian said. "You are choosing not to be." He held Edmund's gaze. "I take the concern on record. I do not share it. Is there anything else?" Edmund stood. He collected his folder. He paused at the door. "The ward boy was spoken to," he said, in the tone of a man adding an afterthought that was not an afterthought at all. "Yesterday evening, by Lord Ashby's senior aide, in the East Corridor. I understand it was a frank conversation about appropriate roles." He left. Adrian sat for 3 seconds. Then he stood. He walked out of his office and down the corridor with the quiet, focused pace that made the guards along the wall adjust their posture without being told to. He went to the second-floor review room, where Finn worked most afternoons. Finn was at the long table, with papers spread before him. He looked up when Adrian entered, and his expression stayed entirely neutral, which was the specific expression that told Adrian the opposite. He closed the door. He sat down across from Finn. "What did Ashby's aide say to you?" he said. Finn looked at him. "It does not require your attention." "Tell me what he said." "It was a conversation. Unpleasant but not—" Finn stopped. He looked at the table. Then he said, steadily, "He told me to consider the position I was placing you in, by continuing in this role. He said that certain members of the court had begun reviewing my background, and that aspects of it, my designation, my history, the manner of my appointment, would be raised formally if I did not, of my own choice, step down quietly. He said a quiet resignation would be handled with discretion and that my previous record would be respected." A pause. "He also told me that the alternative would be less quiet." The room was silent. Finn looked up. Adrian's face had not changed in any dramatic way. It had simply stopped being still in the way that it was still. There was a quality in his expression now that was different from composure, in the same way that a river running fast is different from water that is not moving. "Which member of the court sent him?" Adrian said. "He did not say." "Do you have an inference?" "More than one," Finn said. "I would rather not name them without being certain." "Do you wish to resign the position?" Adrian said. Finn looked at him steadily. "No," he said, "I do not." Adrian stood. "Good," he said. He walked directly to Edmund Price's office. Edmund was at his desk. He looked up. He registered what he saw and set down his pen. "Lord Ashby's aide approached a member of my advisory staff," Adrian said. "He instructed that staff member to resign under the implication of a formal campaign. This occurred in my building, during my staff's working hours, without my knowledge, and in direct contravention of the court's own conduct protocols." Edmund opened his mouth. "The aide's credentials to this court are to be revoked before the end of today," Adrian said. "A formal letter is to go to Lord Ashby, explaining that unauthorized contact with Crown advisory staff will not be repeated. And I want it understood, through whatever channel you find appropriate, that another approach of this kind to any member of my staff will have consequences that the parties involved will find significantly more serious than a formal letter. Is there anything unclear about what I have said?" "Nothing," Edmund said quietly. Adrian left. He walked back down the corridor. He passed 2 Lord delegates who had signed the first petition. He did not stop. He did not address them. He simply moved past them with the complete certainty of a man who had made a decision and had no interest in revisiting it, and both men found somewhere else to look. He went back to the review room. Finn was still at the table. He looked up when Adrian came in. "What did you do?" he said. "Addressed it," Adrian said. "You did not have to." "Finn." He said it once, quietly. He waited until Finn looked at him. "You were not alone in that corner, because of any failure of yours. You are not in it now. What happens in this building to members of my staff is something I am responsible for." A pause. "You do not need to manage these things alone." Finn was quiet for a moment. His expression moved through something that his composure did not quite contain. He said, "Thank you." "It is not a matter of thanks," Adrian said. "It is a matter of what is right." They looked at each other across the table. The distance between them, always present, always professionally maintained, the careful gap that appropriate working relationships required, was simply smaller than it had been. Not gone, but no longer the same size. "Shall we continue with the Eastern Agriculture Review?" Finn said. "Yes," Adrian said, "we shall." They continued. The full council met on the first Monday of every month, in the large formal chamber, at the center of the administrative wing. It was the most structured event in the palace calendar, assigned seating in order of seniority, a formalized procedural sequence that had not substantively changed in 40 years, and the kind of organized gravity that these gatherings produced when everyone in them understood that what was said in this room became part of the institutional record. Adrian arrived 11 minutes early, which was unusual. He stood in the antechamber while Clara reviewed the morning's agenda with him and said, at the end of her recitation, "I am adding an item." Clara looked up from her notes. "After the agenda has been finalized." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "The notification protocol for agenda additions." "I know the protocol," he said, without any sharpness but with a direction to it that settled the question. "I am adding an item." She wrote it down without asking what it was. That was the kind of professional she was. The chamber filled at the appointed time with the quiet, organized purpose of formal preparation. Council members took their assigned seats. Department heads arranged their materials, the outer ring filled with observers, senior staff, and the Lord delegates who held permanent court positions. The chamber settled into the particular attentive hush that preceded these sessions. Finn arrived on time. He walked to his place at the table and sat down, and opened his notes, and did not allow himself to pay attention to the assessments happening around him, the glances from the outer ring, the carefully neutral expressions of people who had submitted petitions about his presence, and were awaiting the outcome of those petitions. The session opened. Adrian moved through the first 5 agenda items with practiced efficiency. Each one addressed, moved to its appropriate next stage, and closed. The room responded to him with the combination of respect and close attention that powerful people generated in the people who were professionally dependent on them. 40 minutes in, Adrian said, "There is one additional item." The adjustment in the room was immediate and subtle. Unannounced additions to a finalized agenda were uncommon. Everyone in the chamber understood that unscheduled items in this format were significant. "Effective immediately," Adrian said, "I am restructuring the senior advisory role. The position of advisory aide is elevated to Chief Counsel of the Iron Peak Kingdom. The Chief Counsel holds full governing authority, co-equal with Senior Counsel in the areas of policy review, strategic planning, and legislative advisory function. The position reports directly to the Crown." He paused. "The position is appointed to Finn Ward." The room absorbed it. That was the only word for what happened. Not explosion, but absorption. The specific controlled intake of something large and unexpected. The adjustment was visible in the set of shoulders, in the glances that crossed the table faster than people intended them to, in one involuntary intake of breath from somewhere at the far end of the room. Edmund Price looked at the table directly in front of him. Lord Philip, Ashby's representative, looked at Adrian with no expression at all, which was its own expression. Finn looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at Finn. Not with apology, not with triumph. With the same direct, unqualified attention he had given Finn since the first evening in the summit study room, the kind that did not dress itself up or soften itself down. "The appointment will be formalized before the end of this week," Adrian said. "Is there business from the floor?" A pause of 4 seconds. Then Lydia Grant said, calmly, and with the professional ease of someone who had decided that moving forward was the appropriate response, "I believe the Eastern Trade Agreement Review was left in a productive position. Shall we continue from there?" The meeting continued. Afterward, in the corridor, 2 Lord delegates stopped in front of Finn. He recognized them from the second petition. One of them said, "This is highly irregular." "Yes," Finn said. "I imagine it is. The role has always been held by a senior official with the required capability," Finn said, quietly and without heat. "The king has made the determination about capability. He has the authority to make that determination. Is there something you need from my office today, Lord Perrin?" Lord Perrin looked at him. Then he stepped aside. Finn walked to his room. He stood in it for 2 minutes. He breathed in the particular, disciplined way of someone managing something large. "Chief Counsel," said in a formal council chamber, in front of every member of the court, with immediate effect and no prior warning. He was grateful for the lack of warning, actually. He would have argued against it. Adrian had known that. Adrian had accounted for it. After 2 minutes, he straightened his jacket and went to the study. Adrian was at the window. He turned when Finn came in. "Sit down," he said. "I would prefer to stand," Finn said. "I know," Adrian said. "Sit down anyway." Finn sat. Adrian moved from the window to the chair directly across from Finn. Not the chair behind his desk, but the one that was for equals. And he sat in it and said, "I owe you a conversation." "You could have told me it was coming," Finn said. "Yes," Adrian said. "I chose not to, because I believed you would argue me out of it." "I would have tried," Finn said. "Yes," Adrian said. "Which is why I did not tell you." A short silence. The quality of it was different from the working silence they had been sharing for months. It had more weight, more direction. "6 weeks ago," Adrian said, "I went through your complete administrative file, the employment record, the cross-referenced anonymous submissions, the margin annotations in the summit transcriptions." He held Finn's gaze. 7 years of original work, submitted through anonymous channels because no other channel was available to you. Policy analysis that outperformed what my senior advisors produced with full resources. Strategic assessments that were more accurate than commissioned reviews that cost this office significant expenditure. He stopped. Then he said, quietly, "I have advisors who have been in this court for 20 years. What I read in those files was better than most of what they produce." Finn looked at the floor. "You spent 11 years making yourself invisible," Adrian said. "Not by choice. Because the world you were working in had decided before you opened your mouth that what you had to say did not count. You worked at that level, consistently, without recognition, because the alternative was to not work at all, and that was apparently not something you were willing to do." He paused. "I cannot return those 11 years to you, but I can ensure that the next 11 look different. That is what today was." Finn was quiet for a moment. "Is that all it was?" he said. Adrian looked at him. "No," he said. "The appointment was what your work deserved. Those two things happened to be the same, which was fortunate." He paused. "What I am about to say is separate from the appointment and from the work. It is personal. You can respond to it however you choose, and your response will not affect your role or my professional conduct, regardless of what it is." Finn waited. "I have feelings for you," Adrian said. "I have been aware of them for some time. I chose not to speak about them until after the appointment was made, because I did not want you to have any reason to question whether the appointment was made for the right reasons. I wanted to give you what your work deserved, before I told you anything about what I felt." He said it simply, without decoration or performance. That is all. The room was very quiet. Finn looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "You are the most exasperating person I have ever worked with." Adrian blinked. "You revise your positions without openly acknowledging that you have revised them," Finn continued. "You make significant decisions without consulting the people most directly affected by them. You brought tea to the study one evening without asking whether I wanted tea, and then proceeded as if that had not happened. You reviewed 7 years of my private work and did not mention it until tonight. And you are currently sitting across from me saying something that I have been working very hard not to name for 3 months, and you appear to expect me to receive it calmly." "I did not say I expected calm," Adrian said. "Good," Finn said, "because I am not going to manage calm right now." He did not move from his chair. He kept his hands on his knees and looked at Adrian across the small distance between them, and said, "I have feelings for you as well. I have been aware of them for a similarly inconvenient period of time, and have been managing them with what I consider to be a reasonable degree of discipline given the circumstances." "A comparable degree of discipline," Adrian said, and something had entered his voice that had not been there a moment before, something quiet and off-center and entirely unperformed. "Yes," Finn said, "comparable." They looked at each other. "What would you like to do about it?" Adrian said. Finn thought about this carefully, because he thought about everything carefully, and this was not a question he was willing to be careless with. "Slowly," he said. "I want to take this slowly. I do not want to be folded into a version of your life where I am secondary to it. I want to remain who I am, everything that I am." "You are the chief counsel of this kingdom," Adrian said. "Secondary is not a position that is currently on offer. You know what I mean." "I do," Adrian said. and I would not want anything else. A pause. Finn breathed. All right, he said. Slowly then. Slowly, Adrian agreed. They did not move from their chairs. But the room had changed, the way rooms change when something real arrives in them. It was the same chairs, the same fire, the same maps on the walls. But the arrangement of things inside the space was different now, and both of them knew it. We have 4 briefing documents for tomorrow's session, Finn said. We do, Adrian said. We should begin. Yes, Adrian said. We should. They began. The word moved through the court with the speed that significant words always moved. Quickly, thoroughly, and in every direction at once. By the following morning, everyone who needed to know had been informed, and by the morning after that, several people who had not needed to know had been informed as well. Because courts were places where information was currency, and the appointment of an Omega to the position of chief counsel was currency of considerable value. The reactions sorted themselves into roughly 3 categories. The first was adjustment, not enthusiasm, not welcome, but the practical recalibration of people who understood that a formally appointed chief counsel, with the Crown's explicit backing, was someone their work needed to engage with, regardless of what they privately thought about the appointment. General Hugh Croft, who had already made his assessment of Finn in the Summit War Room and had not changed it, began routing his border reports directly to Finn's office, rather than waiting for the formal channel. He did this without announcement and without explanation, which was the way Croft did everything that was not a direct military order. Lydia Grant arrived at a joint briefing in the 5th month, with a piece of work specifically designed to interface with Finn's previous analysis. It was a professional gesture, made without ceremony, and Finn received it in the same way. The second category was formal compliance, paired with sustained distance. This was the most populated category. These were people who addressed Finn correctly when their work required it, followed the procedural requirements of his role without deviation, and otherwise maintained a coolness that was too consistent to be accidental, and too controlled to be directly confrontational. It was the court's version of an objection on record, present, clear, and plausibly deniable. Edmund Price was in this category, and he was its most precise representative. The third category was the people who had already filed the petitions and had received a clear answer about those petitions and were now navigating the space between their private position and their public obligation. This was the smallest category, but it was the most active in terms of the things it said in private rooms. Finn managed all 3 categories with the same disciplined steadiness. He had been managing other people's opinions of him for a long time. He understood that he could not change how people felt. He could only do his work with enough consistency and quality. That feeling required more and more effort to maintain. He was patient about this. He was not optimistic, because optimism required assumptions about other people's willingness to change, and he preferred evidence to assumptions. But he was patient. The Eastern Trade Agreement was ratified in the 6th month. The version that passed incorporated the Territorial Affairs Office model Finn had proposed, not the full direct representation structure he had argued for at midnight over a 40-page document, but a meaningful compromise that created a direct channel for territory concerns without dismantling the existing Lord framework entirely. It was not exactly what Finn had wanted. It was significantly better than what had existed before. He sat in the chamber when the vote was recorded and kept his face still. Later, in the study, he told Adrian that the direct representation model remained the structurally correct long-term solution. "I know," Adrian said, "but governing is not always the ideal solution. It is usually the best available solution, given existing constraints." "That is a frustrating observation," Finn said. "You have made it to me on 4 separate occasions," Adrian said. "Correct observations remain correct, regardless of how often they have been stated previously," Finn said. "Yes," Adrian said, with that quiet, sideways quality that had been appearing in his expression with increasing frequency. "But they are also more frustrating when directed at you than when you direct them at me." "Considerably more frustrating," Finn agreed. Their working life and their personal life were not separate things, and they had not tried to make them separate things, because that would have required a level of artificial division that neither of them had the patience for. They worked together every day. They also spent time together outside of work, in the courtyard after long sessions when the evening was cool and the lanterns were lit, at shared meals on the nights when the schedule permitted them, in conversations that began with policy and arrived, through a route neither of them planned, somewhere entirely different. Adrian asked him about his years before the court, not the professional record, but the person inside it, the 19-year-old with the locked journals and the raised hand. Finn told him. In pieces, over time, the way you tell things to someone you have begun to trust, with the specific weight of them. Adrian told him things in return. About the first years of his reign, when he had been 24, and in charge of more than he had been fully prepared for. About the particular loneliness of being a certain kind of powerful. Not the visible loneliness that people would have been moved by, but the interior kind, that came from spending years in rooms full of people who were performing for you, rather than talking to you. About looking for something he had not known how to name, until he had found it accidentally in the corner of a hall. You were looking for an equal, Finn said, one evening. He had not planned to say it. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. And you found one, in a record keeper. I found one, where I found one, Adrian said. The location is beside the point. The kingdom's governance continued and improved, in the incremental way that administrative systems improved when they were working better than they had been. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small, consistent gains that added up over time. The Territorial Affairs Office processed its first 3 cases in its opening month, and resolved all 3 faster than the previous system had managed equivalent situations in 2 years. A housing initiative for border-displaced families was put into practice, and within a year had meaningfully reduced the number of households without stable support. The Eastern Trade Agreement settled into operation without the friction that had characterized its predecessor. The court watched these outcomes. Some people watched them grudgingly, the way people watched things they had argued against and did not want to be seen being persuaded by. Others watched with the slower, more honest recalibration of people, whose prior certainty was encountering evidence that required accounting for. In the 10th month, Lord Perrin, who had stepped in front of Finn in the corridor after the council announcement and asked whether the appointment was irregular, submitted a territory concerns request to the new affairs office. He filled it out completely and correctly. He appeared to find nothing remarkable about this. Finn noted it without comment. He told Adrian. Lord Perrin is a practical man, Adrian said. He objects to things that do not serve him, and uses things that do. That is not the same as changing his mind, Finn said. No, Adrian said, but it is progress of a kind. People who use things eventually become people who value them. The valuing takes longer, but it generally comes. Finn considered this. It was the kind of observation that was probably true, and also required more patience than Finn naturally possessed, to apply without reservation. He stored it anyway, in the way he stored things that were useful even when they were uncomfortable. You are more patient with people than I am, he said. You are more precise about people than I am, Adrian said. We balance each other out. Is that what we do? Finn said. Among other things, Adrian said. Among other things. A phrase that contained a great deal without saying any of it, which was the kind of phrase that Adrian used when he had something he considered sufficient and did not feel the need to elaborate on. Finn had learned to recognize these phrases and to understand that they were, in their quiet way, complete. He had also, slowly and with some difficulty, learned to be comfortable in the fullness of his new life. The title, the authority, the presence in rooms that had previously been closed to him, the work that was no longer hidden. It was larger than what he had built for himself, and it required constant adjustment, and the person he made the adjustment alongside was the same person who had asked for it, which made it, on balance, something he could do. Years passed. Not simply, and not without difficulty, because nothing in the Iron Peak Kingdom's history had been simple or without difficulty, and there was no reason to expect the nature of governance to change simply because the people conducting it were conducting it better than usual. But the years accumulated, and what they left behind took the shape of things built carefully over time, rather than things arrived at by luck or accident. The Territorial Affairs Office marked its 3rd year with a published report that made the Finance Council deeply uncomfortable. Not because the numbers were bad, because they were significantly better than projected, and better numbers were harder to argue against than worse ones, and the Finance Council had built a portion of its institutional identity on arguing against things. The housing initiative had reached its intended scale. The Eastern Trade Agreement was in its second renewal cycle and proceeding without the structural disputes that had defined negotiations around its predecessor. None of this belonged to Finn alone, and he would have been the first to say so. It was the product of a system made to work better, through the contribution of many people and the implementation of many more. But in the quiet, honest conversations that happened among people who paid attention to how things worked and why, the understanding was present. It was simply not always spoken aloud. Edmund Price retired in the 6th year. He came to Finn's office before his final council session. Came to Finn, which was itself a thing that had not happened before, because Edmund Price had always required people to come to him. He sat down without setting his hands on his knees, which had always been his body's signal that he was managing something carefully. He simply sat. "You have done good work," he said. Finn looked at him steadily. "Thank you, Edmund." "I was wrong," Edmund said. He said it directly, and without the elaborate framing he usually applied to difficult statements. "About the appointment, about what it would mean, I was wrong." "You adjusted," Finn said. "Over time, that was not nothing. Not quickly enough." "Few people adjust quickly," Finn said. "It matters more that they adjust at all." Edmund looked at his hands for a moment. Then he stood and offered his hand. Finn took it. It was not a resolution of everything that had passed between them across 6 years of difficult working proximity. It was not meant to be. It was a true thing, said between two people who had not found it easy to understand each other, which was its own kind of weight, and Finn held it with the respect it deserved. After Edmund left, Finn sat for a moment with the quiet of the office around him. He thought about a council room 11 years earlier, a hand raised that no one had acknowledged, and an official who had looked through him as if the space he occupied were empty. He thought about how long the distance between that room and this one had actually been, and how it had been covered, not in one dramatic step, but in thousands of small, deliberate ones, most of them invisible to anyone who was not paying close attention. Gerald Marsh had withdrawn from active court involvement in the 3rd year, not dramatically. There was no confrontation, no formal departure, no scene. The mineral rights dispute had been formally reviewed and decided in the Crown's favor. Through the very council process Gerald had tried to subvert at the summit, and after that ruling, Gerald had submitted the required formal acknowledgement and had simply, gradually, been present less. He still held his territory. He attended obligatory formal occasions. He did not raise the issue again. It was the ending that most things had in governance when managed correctly, not a defeat with visible edges, but a conclusion that arrived through process and time. Finn did not find satisfaction in this. He found it complete, which was different. In the 7th year, a formal inquiry arrived from the Eastern Territories, not a complaint, a request to observe the territorial affairs model with a view to implementing a version of it in their own governance structure. The request was addressed to the Chief Counsel's office. Finn drafted the response himself and passed it to Adrian for review as a matter of protocol. It came back with 2 minor revisions and a note in the margin that said simply, "Good," which was what good looked like when Adrian Cole wrote it, and which Finn had learned to read correctly. The delegation arrived the following season. 5 people, led by a young woman named Kara, who was perhaps 22, and had the particular alertness of someone who had prepared for a meeting more thoroughly than the meeting would end up requiring. They spent 3 days together. Finn answered their questions about the model's design and its implementation, what had worked from the beginning, and what had taken longer to function as intended, what he would do differently if he were starting from the beginning. He told them that the model was not a finished thing, that governance was never a finished thing, that a working structure was always an ongoing negotiation between what you needed and what was currently possible, and that the real work lived in the space between those two things. On the 2nd day, Kara asked him how the framework concept had originally developed. Finn was quiet for a moment. "I had been thinking about it for 11 years, he said, before anyone asked." She looked at him. "No one asked for 11 years?" "No." She was quiet. Then she said, "That seems like a significant amount of lost time, for everyone." "Yes," Finn said, "it does." He thought about that conversation in the evening, in the study, and told Adrian about it. Adrian listened without interrupting. When Finn finished, he said, "She is right." "I know," Finn said. "I knew at 19. That is rather the point." "The point," Adrian said, is that those 11 years ended. Whatever was lost in them has a fixed size now. It cannot grow. He paused. The next 11 will not look like them. Finn looked at him. What will they look like? Adrian considered the question with the genuine attention he gave to genuine questions. I cannot say exactly, he said, but I know who will be in them. Finn looked at the wall for a moment. That is the most sentimental thing you have ever said to me, he said. Do not repeat it, Adrian said. I have a standing reputation. Your standing reputation, Finn said, is currently founded primarily on having appointed an Omega record keeper as chief counsel, and having the appointment improve every measurable governance outcome in the kingdom. That is not my reputation, Adrian said. That is my record. They are different things. Are they? Less so every year, Adrian said. In the 9th year, the records office completed a project that had been quietly underway for some time. A comprehensive reclassification of the anonymous submissions archive from the previous 12 years, cross-referenced with contributor identification codes, and formally attributed where the records permitted it. The project was clerical in nature. It was not announced. It was simply done, as clerical things were done, thoroughly and without ceremony. When Finn received the notification that the reclassification had been completed, he read it once. Then he set it on his desk and went to the window and stood there for a while. In the records of the Iron Peak Kingdom, carefully maintained by a thorough records office in a building that had housed the same institutional memory for several hundred years, there was now a proper attribution attached to 7 years of policy work that had previously carried no name. Finn Ward, contributor. Not invisible. Not in the corner. Not the person managing the correct answer from behind a wall of deliberate silence. He had always known the answers were his. That had never been the question. The question had been whether the world he lived in would ever make room for that to be known. It had taken a long time. It had not been a gift. It had been the result of 11 years of continuing to work in private, and 3 more of doing the work in the open, of refusing to become smaller than he was, even when smallness was what the room preferred, of a king who had looked into a corner and chosen to see what was there rather than what he expected to find. He went back to his desk. There was work to do. He sat down and began it. That evening, he was still in the study when Adrian came in from a late diplomatic meeting. Adrian set his coat on the chair near the door and crossed the room and sat in the chair across from Finn, the chair that was for equals, which was the chair he always chose now. Still working, Adrian said. Still working, Finn agreed. Adrian looked at him for a moment. The fire was lower than it should have been. The evening was late. 7 years of difficult, particular, carefully built life sat in the room around them, visible in the maps on the walls, and the double annotated documents on the desk, and the specific easy way they occupied the same space. Are you well? Adrian said. It was a simple question. Adrian asked it when he meant it, and did not ask it when he did not, which was one of the things about him that Finn had catalogued early, and never stopped appreciating. Yes, Finn said. The records office completed the attribution project. Adrian was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. You knew, Finn said. I authorized it, Adrian said. Some time ago. Finn looked at him. Your work belongs to you, Adrian said. The record should reflect that. You did that without telling me, Finn said. I have done several things without telling you, Adrian said. You have an established pattern of arguing against things that are clearly correct. I argue against things I have not been consulted on, Finn said. In this case, the consultation would have become an argument, Adrian said, and the argument would have delayed a correct thing getting done. So I made the determination, and allowed the process to proceed. Finn looked at him for a long moment. You are the most exasperating person I have ever worked with, he said. Yes, Adrian said. You have told me that before. It remains true. I imagine it will continue to. Finn looked at the fire. He thought about the records office notification sitting on his desk, and what it meant, and what it had cost, and how long the road between the cost and the meaning had actually been. He thought about all of it, the locked journals and the narrow bed and the 11 years, and the summit hall, and the gray eyes that had found him in the corner without a visible reason, as if they were simply in the habit of finding things correctly. He thought about everything that had been built since then, Not just the policies and the frameworks and the measurable outcomes that appeared in annual reports. The other thing. The thing that lived in the space between two chairs positioned across from each other, and between two people who had never found a comfortable way to be small. I did not plan for any of this, Finn said. Nor did I, Adrian said. And yet here we are. Here we are, Adrian said, simply, without decoration, the way true things sounded when they were simply stated. Here was the study of the Iron Peak Palace, on a late evening, after a long day, with work on the desk, and a fire that needed attention, and a future that neither of them had a full map of. It was not what Finn had imagined for himself when he was 19, with a raised hand, and no one to acknowledge it. It was not the life of invisibility he had constructed after that. It was something he had not had a blueprint for, built in collaboration with someone he had not expected to meet, in a direction he had not seen coming. He had spent 11 years making himself invisible. He had spent 3 more becoming visible, in a world that was not entirely ready for it. He had done it by refusing the alternative, consistently, across many rooms and many years and many mornings, that required the same deliberate choice to continue. He had done it by understanding that the work was the argument, and that the argument had to be made with evidence rather than noise, and that evidence required time. He had done it, in the end, because he had found one person who had looked into a corner and seen the whole of what was there, and had made room for it, and had asked for nothing in return, except the same honesty in exchange. The fire needed attending to. Finn stood and crossed the room and added a log to it, and watched the flame recover. Adrian was watching him. The Kara delegation sent a follow-up letter, Finn said, returning to his chair. They want to begin the implementation phase. They are asking for a senior consultant from our affairs office to assist with the first 6 months. Do you have someone in mind? Adrian said. Owen Holt's former deputy, Finn said. She has the technical knowledge, and she understands the political sensitivity. She would also, I think, find the assignment professionally meaningful. Good choice, Adrian said. I know, Finn said. And then, because even after years he still sometimes said it before he could hear how it landed, he added, no, Adrian said. He was looking at Finn with that expression, the quiet, warm, unperformed thing that had no precise name but was entirely itself. You are right, that is all. They both looked at the fire for a moment. We have the border infrastructure briefing in the morning, Finn said. We do. And the trade renewal review in the afternoon. Yes. Then we should finish the evening documents. Yes, Adrian said. We should. They did. Outside, the palace courtyard was dark beneath its lanterns, the same stones it had always been, unchanged. Inside, in a study that had once held one man's solitary decisions, and now held 2 people's shared ones, the fire burned, and the work continued, and the record of what had been built accumulated quietly, in the ways that real things accumulated, not all at once, not with announcement, but with the slow and honest weight of things that were made to last. The world that had decided what they were before they had the chance to show it, remained, in many ways, the world it had always been. It did not transform overnight. Other people in other corners were still doing their best work, in margins where no one was reading. The change that had happened here was specific and partial, and required continued effort to sustain. Finn knew this as clearly as he knew anything, because he was a policy person, and policy people understood that structural change happened in layers, and lived in systems, and required maintenance. But something existed now that had not existed before, a model, a record, a name in an archive where there had previously been no name, a precedent that could be pointed to and argued from, built on and extended, by the next person who sat in a corner with the right answers and the wrong designation. That was the nature of change that mattered, not the single dramatic moment, the thing you left that the next person could use. What Finn Ward and Adrian Cole had left was real. What they had built was real. What they had found in each other, in the difficult space between who the world had told them to be and who they actually were, was real. And no version of the world that had tried to tell them otherwise had been right.